There are so many tricks you can use right now to make your art feel much more alive, and surprisingly, no one ever talks about them. You probably struggle with looking at your art wondering why it just feels so boring to look at. Why it doesn't make you feel anything. It has to be my shading, or maybe the way I pose my characters, right? The thing is though, the way you're thinking here is too simple, because the actual problem is a lot deeper than you might think. So I'm going to be talking about 3 of the biggest techniques you need to know that will instantly breathe life into all of your art. Starting off with trick number 1, this one alone completely changed how I approached art, because it affects everything. From your coloring, posing, even to your character's design. So when I first started off in art, I struggled with the fact that most of my art felt like it looked the same. Just like looking at it, nothing really stands out. It wasn't until recently that I finally figured out what makes something engaging. And once I did, my art instantly got better. Take a look at this drawing of my OC Crimson. It has some nice stuff like the background and the lighting, but you might be surprised when I say this. This drawing is actually complete dog shit. Here's another drawing I did with a similar vibe. Dark environment, and both characters have this kind of backlighting. However, the sketch thumbnail surprisingly feels much more engaging even though it's just a sketch. So keep in the back of your mind why you might think this is. A problem I see a lot of beginners have is that they don't really understand what makes something look interesting. So what can you actually do to make things more dynamic instead of just feeling like it blends together? The easiest way to do this is by breaking your art into 2 clear parts. To understand this better, let's look at some examples that you can try right now. One thing you can do to literally any piece of artwork is simply adding a shadow over the entire object and then adding some sort of rim lighting. Looking at this drawing of a cyberpunk girl I did, it looks really good on its own. But applying this technique, you can tell that the colors feel much more dynamic because of the clear distinction of the values. Another thing you can do is make a background that has contrasting hues with your character. Scarlet looks fine on her own, but throwing in a background that's the opposite of her red and black color scheme makes her stand out even more. Colors are a pretty obvious example, so let's talk about how you can use this idea with something like posing. With posing, it's important that the basic shapes of your characters feel distinct from one another. If they all feel like they're oriented the same, it can look really boring. Here's a drawing I did of a fucked up Invincible. I had to remove the blood for obvious reasons, but his pose feels dynamic. And it's not about his perspective. The reason it looks interesting is how his head and arms are a completely different orientation than the rest of his body. Lastly, the reason this thumbnail from earlier looked so much better was because of this bright explosion that contrasted the main character's dark values. In Crimson's drawing, everything in her artwork was only dark, so it looked a lot more dull. If your art feels boring, all you have to do is add one simple contrasting dynamic. Adding contrast to anything in your art is what makes it infinitely more interesting to look at. Knowing this trick certainly helped boost the creativity of my art, but this next one is what really made my art feel alive. Moving on to number 2, this trick really made my art feel like it was a moving picture. So funny enough, I actually learned this from copying Valorant's key character art. I really love the artwork from Valorant because every drawing just emphasizes the personality of each character. I really want to specifically look at these sketches of Neon since her art shows off this concept the most. What is the first thing you look at within each of these sketches? Your eye is probably instantly caught on these lightning effects since they really emphasize the movement of Neon. If you imagine these effects as a noise, they'd be like or you might be thinking the trick is just to slap on some cool effects on your art, but there's something deeper going on here. So something I notice a lot from beginners who draw is that when they draw their body or hair, or really anything, they literally just draw it on the spot without any planning. Without proper planning, you'll end up making choices that feel unintentional, and it'll make your art feel flat. But the solution to fix this is so easy that you'll wonder why the fuck you didn't do it in the first place. Something that most artists don't understand is the power of lines. When people hear line, they usually just think of line art. But lines are so much more than that. Take a look at this line. You're probably following it with your eyes, aren't you? Let me lay this stack of falling boxes on top of it. You're still following it with your eyes as if it were moving. This is such a powerful thing you can apply to anything in your art to give it much more energy. A really good example on how you can use this is through your character's poses. All you have to do is draw a line and have your character's pose follow it. You can add as many lines as needed to plan out each part of your character. Imagine you're basically drawing a simple stick figure to plan out the flow and structure of your drawing. If the stick figure feels dynamic as fuck, then you can bet your character will as well. And don't be thinking so simple either. This can be used for other parts of your character, like their hair or clothing. To make your pose even more interesting, you can combine this with the first trick. If we look at this image of Astra from Valorant, you can see that her galaxy is following a rotational line of action, but Astra herself is actually stiff, which creates a super interesting dynamic. My personal favorite way of capturing movement through lines is through effects like we saw with Neon. Here's a commission I did where the character is following a bent line, and the flames are following a circular line around it, kind of like a wheel and axle. For our second trick, before you draw anything, plan out your composition with simple lines to create that sense of movement. These lines help guide the overall structure and flow of a pose, which can make it feel more natural looking and expressive. As powerful as these two tricks are though, they'll fall flat if you don't understand this last one. Last but not least, this is one of the most important tricks to know if your art doesn't feel like it has its own personality, like it's kind of just a blob of random shit. This technique actually came to me while I was studying line art, and it helped me understand what gave a drawing an identity. Let's play a little game. I'm going to show you 4 objects for a quick millisecond, and I'm going to ask you what object you saw in a chosen corner. I recommend you try to stare at the center and use your peripheral vision. Ready? What did you see in the top right corner? You probably didn't get it. It was an ATM. Let's try that again. Ready? What was in the bottom right corner? You definitely got it this time. It was a game controller. If we put both objects on the screen, you'll notice one of them is legit just one solid color. Okay, so what's the point of all this? The thing that bothers me about so many beginner artists is that they only care about learning how to shade and adding small details that barely change how their art looks. And most of the time, it just ends up making their drawings look like a huge mess. You might be really mad that I'm telling you not to focus so much on learning how to shade, but let's think about this for a second. When we look at a piece of art, our eyes aren't able to process every single shadow or highlight of the drawing. That is way too much information for our brains to handle. So we kind of just blur everything together and things become more of a general 2D shape rather than a 3D form. And my problem with most anime art is that they don't take advantage of that. While the shading is often nice and detailed, if you took that away from it, the shapes are usually really awkward looking, or it's very hard to understand what is happening. So how can we take advantage of this concept, and what can we actually do to make our shapes stand out? To answer that first question, you can literally use this concept to anything in your art. We already saw how you can tell whether a drawing is awkward from how the shape of each part of it looks and how it's composed, but we can even do this with the shading of each object. When artists shade, they don't simply shade right off the bat. They usually plan it using solid shapes, and then they go back and make them look soft shaded. One last thing, shapes are perfect for character design. The most unique character designs are the ones with the best silhouettes that you can't find on any other character. So now, how can we make sure the shapes in our art are good and stand out? The definition of a good shape really depends on your art style, so I'm just going to talk about my personal philosophy. A good rule of thumb that I follow is that if I can't feel the form of my drawing using only shapes, I probably did something wrong. An easier way of thinking about this is making a cube using only 2D shapes. Even without shading, you can tell that this is a cube. Lastly, what I personally do is before I even move on to actually drawing, I take a moment to block out what I want the silhouette of my character to look like. And then after that, I block out individual elements like the hair or clothing. This helps me be more confident that my drawing is gonna look unique and dynamic, instead of feeling like any other piece of anime artwork. Circling back to those images from earlier, looking at the silhouette of the ATM, this could have been anything. There's not a lot of strong shapes that scream that this is an ATM. The controller, on the other hand, it is undeniable that it is a controller because of the great use of shapes to emphasize the buttons, and the overall shape is just really unique. The final most important trick is to simply paint the shape of your object before sketching it. Since humans recognize shape before anything else, if your shape isn't clear or if you're not personally satisfied with how it looks, it's gonna look bad. So, you know, don't do that. You'd be surprised to learn that the only reason 99% of artists don't understand these concepts is because they never studied the fundamentals of art. If you'd like to be that 1% of artists who succeed in art, check out this video where I introduce you to the thing that so many people never bother to learn.